Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Paulmeyer and Katja Dev.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode. I'm Mercedes Paulmeyer, and this is part 3 in our Auto-Regulation and RPE. And today we're going to be focusing on hangboarding and some strategies to help you first understand what failure means in hangboarding and what RPE you should be going for when it comes to getting your fingers stronger. So if you haven't listened to part 1 or 2, I do recommend going back, especially to part 1, because I kind of lay the groundwork for what auto-regulation is, what RPE is, and what reps in reserve is, because we're actually going to be talking about reps in reserve in today's podcast as well when it comes to hangboarding. This is going to be a shorter episode because, one, there's not a ton to talk about when it comes to hangboarding, but I'm going to focus a lot on the feeling of hangboarding and specifically what beginners should be kind of striving for when it comes to hangboarding. So hangboarding is one of the best ways to build finger strength when we're thinking about kind of like almost like a general strength approach, getting the fingers as strong as possible. Really, the only way you're going to be able to do that is through using some sort of edge. And there are a couple ways that people are now doing hangboarding. There's the traditional hanging from a board where you're hanging off of it. And then now people are using what are called edge lifts or pickups from the ground. And this technique is a really great way to build max finger strength because you can actually lift heavier. But it does feel a little different when you're picking a weight up off the ground versus hanging from the board. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So again, hangboarding is one of the best ways to build finger strength. It's not always a great transfer to climbing though, because there is no movement when you're doing the hangboarding. So anytime that you're doing hangboarding, ideally you're integrating it with climbing sessions. I think it can be good to just solely focus on finger strength and no climbing for a short amount of time. But in general, it's going to integrate better if you're doing both climbing and hangboarding. So what's great about using the RPE scale when it comes to hangboarding is that you're going to be able to understand the right intensity that you need for your fingers based on the time that you're hanging for. And really, my goal is to have everyone train just hard enough to get the gains that they want. And the RPE scale can be really good for you to write down at the end of your session so that you know how much effort you're bringing to each session, and then correlate that to changes in your climbing and just the feeling of strength as well. Because remember, climbing is really hard to measure. Really, the only gauge that we have is a grade, but you're definitely making micro improvements. And so you want to make sure that you're still seeing some improvement in your climbing if you are training. And if you're not trying hard enough, you probably aren't going to see changes in your climbing. If you're putting too much effort or you're trying too hard in your sessions, that can also lead to a stagnation and improvement. So make sure that you're understanding your RPE for every session and how that's correlating to your improvement. And the same goes for hangboarding. And hangboarding kind of is just like strength training, where you can put some measurable numbers to your hanging and you can see those changes over time, which is awesome. But the goal really is to do the least amount and still see improvement. I think it's really easy to overdo hangboarding. And I actually see this often when people start to hangboard, they overdo it, thinking that you have to really bring 110% to those sessions, when really that's actually just putting you into a deeper hole that's harder to recover from. When you are putting too much effort into your hangboarding, usually this is when people are training in the 5 to 10 second range or less, you're maxing out your nervous system. So if you're failing right at the end of those hangs, your nervous system is taking a huge hit. And some people think that that is a good thing, that you're taking your body to failure. You must be getting gains. And if you are seeing gains, great, but often those are short-lived. You can't sustain gains by going to failure all of the time. And if you think about it, when you are training at such a high intensity, you're going to see fluctuations in that weight every time you do that session because you're at your maximum. There's no room to move. And when you max out your nervous system, you might also have some hormonal issues coming along with it. So if you are noticing just like a fluctuation in your max hangs because you are going to failure on those, it could be that your nervous system just is having a really hard time adapting. And when you do fail, it's just really hard for the nervous system to coordinate itself when you're trying so hard. So that's why submax training is much better. It's preferable. And when I say submax, it doesn't mean it's easy. Submax training really is an RPE at least, maybe the least amount is like a 6, RPE 6 up to like an 8. And that's a really great zone to train in almost all year and see sustainable progress over time. It gives you enough wiggle room each day to adapt your training to how you're feeling. And you probably will see more consistent numbers every time you show up versus training to max. All right, so how does finger strength training work when you're using the hangboard? Generally, we're trying to improve the strength of the fingers, not the endurance of the fingers. If you're going to be doing repeaters or anything like that, honestly, it's better just to climb, especially on a board where the holds are kind of the same. I really love the tension board too for that. So if you're looking for more of a repeater style, endurance style workout for your fingers, integrate the rest of your body because, it's most likely it's not just your fingers failing at that point. It's probably your core and maybe your lack of breathing. So when you're using the hangboard, the goal is to increase your strength and not your endurance. You're going to be going at a relatively high intensity, so an RPE above a 6. And you're going to use progressive overload. So that should be gradually increasing the weight over time. And ideally, you're not adding more than 5% of total weight. So when you're thinking about weight, if you're hanging from an edge, you have to incorporate your body weight plus any added weight if you're doing that, or if you're taking weight off. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're making the right calculations and only doing 5% each week if you're even able to do that each week. And then when it comes to the fingers, it's really easy to damage the joint and the tendons. It is super easy because it's such a small anatomy. It's a small part of your body. So make sure that you're constantly checking in when you are training your fingers. And when it comes to beginners, so most beginners, hopefully you've been climbing for about a year before you even think about getting onto a hangboard, mostly because you have you're familiar with how to hold things. And so the hangboard is kind of just an accentuation of that. So for beginners, it's really, you don't need to focus on super high intensity. Your goal should be focusing on how to position your fingers on a hangboard and how your fingers interact with the hangboard. That's going to be your goal in the first couple months of hangboarding, getting familiar with what crimp positions are. Can you put terminology to it and get very comfortable with it, that you could basically close your eyes, get into the position pretty quickly, and you're feeling comfortable. So most hangs for beginners should be at about the RPE 6 range. This can be dependent on the experience of the hangboarder. So if you are relatively new to training, you might not know what RPE is. So if you don't really know what that is, then I would not do hangboarding, and I would actually do some strength training and start using RPE with your strength training, even with your climbing, and start understanding how that feels in your body. before you even think about getting onto the hangboard, because you have to understand what failure is. You have to understand how your body shows up different every day. And you have to understand what effort really feels like in the body as well. So for beginners, about an RPE 6, maybe 7, but really we're going to use reps in reserve. But in this case, we're actually calling it seconds in reserve, because most of our hangboarding is for a duration of time, like anywhere from 1 second to 20 seconds. So we're going to use seconds in reserve as another tool to help you understand how close to failure you are. Okay, so if you are hanging with an RPE 6, then you should be at a 4 to 5 seconds in reserve. So you have 4 to 5 seconds left in the tank before you fail. And Dr. Eva Lopez, who is the finger strength researcher for climbing, she has about 4 seconds left in reserve for most of her beginner and intermediate protocols. It's a great way to build up the tissues and a great way to familiarize yourself to the protocol. She would also agree that, if you've been climbing for at least a year, you're probably ready for some hangboarding. But, I'm not a gatekeeper. If you want to start hangboarding, you can start. But the most important thing is that no matter what level you're at, that you understand what the grip positions are. And in general, like the basic positions are a full crimp, a half crimp, an open crimp, and a 3-finger drag. There are other positions that you can also work on, but these are the basics. And for me personally, for most of the athletes that I work with, they're mostly like intermediate climbers who are getting comfortable on a hangboard. Even my advanced to elite climbers, we will practice just the half crimp and the 3-finger drag. Now, it really depends on what kind of climber you are. As you're climbing, it's good to kind of take note of how you're holding onto things. Some people just naturally go into a full crimp, and you might have heard that full crimps are terrible for you. No, they're really not. They're terrible for you if you've never done them before, and you force yourself into a full crimp. Yes, full crimping does put the most amount of tension on those pulleys, but it doesn't mean it's bad for you. All right, you just got to be smart about it, and you can train smart. That's why you're listening to this podcast, because you're going to do it with some brain power behind it. Okay, so just make sure that you have those positions in mind, no matter where your starting point is. All right, so how RPE relates to hangboarding. One, RPE is actually really difficult to gauge when you're training isometrically, which is basically what we're doing when we're hangboarding. So an isometric means that you're not moving. You're not going through a dynamic motion. You're just holding a position. And that can be just very challenging for us to understand, usually with concentric and eccentric motions or dynamic movements such as a bicep curl. The tension or the effort through the range will give you more feedback as to where you are or how close you are to failure. Whereas an isometric, it really comes on pretty quickly. So there is going to be kind of a long period of time of understanding or developing the understanding of how close to failure you are in these hangs. And it'll feel even more different depending on the type of hangboarding that you're doing. So if you're hanging from a board, is going to feel different to doing the edge lifts or the pickups from the ground. When you do an edge lift or a pickup from the ground, you might actually be able to lift heavier than you would when you are hanging. Maybe not everyone will experience that, but it is a position change. And just know that that's going to change your perception of what's happening. And it feels different on the structures, like your finger structures as well. Okay, so what is failure when it comes to hangboarding? For edge lifts, if you're picking the weight up from the ground using a portable hangboard, the second that you lift from the ground, there should be no change in the position of your hand. This is the most common mistake I see these days, especially with this technique and with influencers now being abundant on Instagram and they want to show you how much they can lift off the ground, you will see them pick up the weight and they start in a half crimp, but the second they pick the weight up, they go into an open crimp. This is a sign that, that is too much weight. Your hand can't sustain that half crimp with that weight. So what are you doing? I really think this is kind of wasted effort. If your intention is to train a half crimp and your position is changing into an open crimp, you're no longer training that half crimp. And your body's literally telling you, you know what, this is way too much weight. I can't sustain this. So the second you lift up the weight, make sure that there is no change in your hand position. There's a lot of other things that come into the like the shoulder and even like leaning back. Like those things are kind of like cheats. I'm focused more on the hand position here because like the edge lift, there's just like a little less going on. So you can focus a little bit more on what's happening in the fingers. Okay, so no change in hand position. If you're changing, if your fingers even open up a little bit, you've already gone to failure. That is failure. All right. And remember, we want to stop before that change happens. So now if you're hanging from a hangboard, you will need to focus on your fingers and your shoulder position. So if you hang and your fingers start to open up a little bit, okay, you've already reached failure. If you're hanging and your fingers stay in the same position, but your shoulders are changing position, they're coming up to your ears, okay, you've actually reached failure or you've gone beyond failure. So it is really important that your shoulders stay engaged the whole time. So your shoulders, maybe in this scenario, could actually be the missing link or the weakest in the chain. Some other things that I see when you're hanging is like even legs coming up because like maybe the core is failing slightly. That is kind of okay. But if you're still relatively new to hangboarding, I would take this as a fail as well. Like you had to change position in order to sustain that position. You're going to be safer just stopping that rep rather than trying to push through it. Okay. And yeah, I think hangboarding really seems to bring out a lot of ego, even for the most humble of climber. So really try not to take the bait. Show your fingers some love and stick to weights that you can control in that grip position. All right, so let's talk about RPE for the hangboard. For no hangs. I've talked about no hangs before. The Emil Abramson protocol. Now, there's still a lot of debate about that protocol. There's a reason why he is getting stronger while still using that protocol, and it could be neurological. That's actually my guess. But if you're going to be doing the no hangs, which I think is a really good place for beginners, is to do the no hangs. And this is generally in the RPE 3 to 5, where it's like 30 to 50% of your 1 rep max. You feel a stretch in your fingers. It's somewhat challenging, but you're not going anywhere close to failure at all. So that's a good place to start if you're just trying to figure out what hand position you want to train, which position is what, understanding terminology, and just integrating hangboarding into your weekly sessions. I think that's perfect. So now if you're using hangboarding to get your fingers strong, we're going to be talking about an RPE 6 or above. So RPE 6 to 7 generally is sustainable effort. This can be really good for like warm-up hangs or for endurance hangs. So this is hangs that are 10 to 15 seconds long, and you have 3 to 4 seconds left in the tank. So this is great for beginner and intermediate protocols. Yeah, and things should feel comfortable at this stage. All right, so just remember seconds in reserve is 3 to 4. RP 8 to 9. This is where we're going to be doing like 5 to 7 second hangs here. This is where you have a lot of control, but it does feel really hard. you might be shaking on these. And you have to focus to really keep that position. And the seconds in reserve is going to be about 1 to 2. So you are very, very close to failure here. And I would say this is best for intermediate to advanced trainees. And then there is RPE 10. This is basically where you're getting to failure. It's really only used in specific cases or for specific people. And the hold times are anywhere from 1 to 5 seconds long. So this means you probably have 0 seconds left in the tank. And this is really, I would say, for advanced and elite trainees. I don't think it's worth for most people to be training at an RPE 10 for in any case, like whether that's climbing, lifting, or doing hangboard. But a few people can get away with it. All right, so how to manage RPE in the week? RPE mostly when it comes to your fingers. Okay, so we're going to zero in on just how the fingers are feeling. So your fingers can actually give you a lot of really good feedback, but because they're such a small structure, they don't always talk super loud in the brain. They're easy to ignore. There could be something going on, but it's easy to ignore. You really have to slow down and kind of like tune in to what is happening in your fingers. And I feel like the only time that your fingers talk loudly is when they're already injured, such as a pulley injury or maybe a joint capsule injury. But there are signs before this even happens, and we just need to tune into it. So the first one is at the end of a session or maybe the next day, if your fingers are feeling really tight and you can't fully close your fists, maybe you have some pain in your joints or 1 or 2 joints as you're moving and closing a fist, that's a sign you've probably done too much in that session. Either if you're doing hangboarding and you have that sensation, you've probably done too much weight or too many sets. If you're climbing and you feel that, it's the same thing. You could potentially have tried too hard, the holds were too small, or you climbed too much. All right. So that's the first thing I want you to tune in into is like, how well is your hand moving? Can you get to full range of motion without any pain or stiffness? The second one is basically just touching or massaging your pulleys. So your pulleys are between the joints and on your joints. So you have a pulley at each stage, and your pulleys are basically there to keep your tendon close to the bone so that it acts as a pulley system, literally. So what you can do is actually just palpate, like touch each pulley and just see, is there any pain? And sometimes there'll be some pain, even if you don't feel it when you're climbing, but you might feel it when you're off the wall and you're just giving it a massage. So that's another indicator that you've pushed a little either too hard or you've done too much volume. All right. So pay attention to those signs at the end of your session or the next day. And that way you can adjust your next session or just take note of, what did I do that caused this pain, and try to decrease whatever your session was for your next session, and monitor your pain over time. By tuning into these signs, you can actually mitigate injury. You're literally doing injury prevention just by tuning into what your fingers are feeling. All right, so how do you adjust your hangboard based on RPE? So again, your body shows up differently every day. Your body experiences stress throughout the whole day, and it will feel a lot harder some days compared to others. So if you're warming up and you feel that your energy is relatively low, okay, no big deal. You can adjust your hangboard session. And some ways to adjust your hangboard session is to go to a larger edge. That, especially if you're a beginner and maybe you're not at a full body weight hang yet, and you have to take weight off or maybe use your toes to take some weight off, then really the only way that you can change the intensity is go to a bigger edge. Or if you don't have that option, then you need to take more weight off. All right. And again, try to aim between a 6 and an 8, or 2 to like 5 seconds left in the tank or seconds in reserve. Another way to adjust your training is if you realize if you're doing the same protocol as, like, let's say last week, and you're doing the same weights, but you're realizing, oof, I am not able to sustain these, no problem. This happens a lot. Again, like, we are pushing a little bit more, in hangboarding, I find, than in strength training. It's a lot more neurological. And so it is going to be common to kind of see more fluctuations. And so just take it back a step. You're still going to see gains even at submax levels. Just remember that. If you're having to back off, that's okay. It's not any worse. You just need a little bit less load on your fingers so your brain can manage it. And you're still going to see gains. And then just remember to monitor your recovery. Max hang sessions or even submax hang sessions can be a lot on the digits, and they might need longer to recover. So just continue to tune in, and there's really no rush. The fingers will adapt as long as you're being kind to them and giving them the right intensity for your sessions. All right, so I hope this helps you understand how to put an RPE to your hangboarding sessions. And really the biggest thing here is knowing what failure is when it comes to hanging, because that is the biggest mistake that I see people make, is that they continue to hang even though they've actually gone past failure point. All right, so that's it for today's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one, friends.